Hey guys, today I want to try to dispel 5 common myths that I hear in permaculture all the time. And actually there's a number of more myths that maybe at another time I'll try to dispel as well. But these 5 are the ones that I find kind of bother me the most and also lead farmers down a path that is not helpful for them. In my consulting practice that I've done for over at least the last 4 years, I've helped a lot of farmers lean out their farms, trim off the fat, and solve problems. And these are things, these 5 particularly, are things that I'm constantly having to tell people, like, look, you can't take all these things at face value. Context is really important, and I'm not here to slander permaculture or anybody in it, because I think overall the permaculture movement has been a good thing and has done mostly good things for people and the planet. But there are some things within the community of farming and agriculture where some of these myths have cost a lot of people a lot of time and other resources. So let's get into them. Right off the bat, I wrote an article about this in Medium, and I'll leave the link below in the show notes. You can check that out. When I do these videos, I kind of ad-lib it, so you might find more detail in that article. You can check that out there. Let me first start with giving a bit of a greater context before I jump into these 5. The reason I think it's worthwhile to analyze these and look at them objectively is that a lot of the people who were the founding people within the permaculture space, Bill Mollison, Jeff Lawton, they have really criticized conventional large-scale agriculture, as they should. I think it's totally merited. However, if you're going to criticize something and offer a solution, that solution should be able to fit within the context of that. So if you're going to criticize large-scale, commercial, conventional agriculture, you should have a solution that can be applied to large-scale, commercial, conventional agriculture. And that is basically the foundation of my criticisms here, is that these things aren't really practical solutions for large-scale agriculture. They might be for a home garden, they might be for a very, very tiny farm, and they might be for a homestead. But from what I can see, none of these things are solutions for large-scale farming. So let's jump into the first one, the myth of the self-sustaining garden. This one often comes from the idea of the forest garden or the food forest. You know, people like Robert Hart and Patrick Whiteman wrote books about forest gardening and videos and all that. And I was really inspired by that stuff when I started. And so the idea of a forest garden is that you've got perennials and you've got different levels of stories in the forest that can produce things for you to eat. And it is a really cool idea in principle. The problem with it is it's not a solution for agriculture. I mean, it might be for a home garden, and this is the thing, again, coming to that if you're going to criticize large-scale agriculture, you got to have something that can be applied to it. And I'm not saying that it couldn't be, but it certainly isn't now, at least not from what I've seen. The problem with a food forest or a forest garden is it's hard to get anything that is dependable from it. So let's just say you're even farming for a small community of people. You need to have regular production that you can depend on. So we're going to have this crop at this time, this crop at this time. I need X amount of this here, X amount of that there. If you don't have that, then you can't rely on it. It's like, you know, hunter-gatherers going out and picking what's available and when. And this is why hunter-gatherer societies didn't advance to the civilization that we know today. Civilization that we know today is 100% based on agriculture. And agriculture is a 100% man-made phenomenon. It does not exist in nature, and I mean that in the most objective way. Some people might subjectively say, oh, well, there's little bits of agriculture here, there's certain symbiotic relationships between some animals and or some insects, and okay, sure, but that's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about food production systems that are so reliable and stable that it allows other people to be specialized in other things. Because in horticultural societies, which is what hunter-gatherer societies were, or small tribes and things like that. Everybody is involved in the gathering of food and the creating of food. And so your life is completely dedicated to just self-sustenance. And that might be a great way to live. There might be many people that want that and desire that, and that's totally cool. Do whatever. But I'm saying that this is not a solution for agriculture if you can't depend on it. You can't really mechanize things, you know. Maybe we get to a point where we have robots doing all agriculture for us and they can go be out foraging in the forest, and maybe that will be the ultimate solution for sustainable agriculture, but that's not the way it is now. And so the problem with the forest garden is, yes, if you set up a food forest, and I've seen them before, I've visited places that have food forests, you can have somewhat of a self-sustaining system because a forest becomes its own ecosystem, and it will produce food and it will do it without much work. However, if you want anything dependable, it requires maintenance. And even in perennials, if you look at orchards or vineyards, if you do a year or two without pruning and managing the vineyard or orchard, it's going to be a nightmare to get it back to a productive state. And that is often, you know, going to take you a lot of time and also hinder that production. Could push you back a year or two. So agriculture needs maintenance. Agriculture needs work. This is, don't buy into the myth that you can just get a bunch of stuff going long term and you can just set it and forget it and you'll live off it forever. Maybe you can have some food to enjoy here and there, but it certainly isn't going to be the backbone of a food system, at least not now. Okay, number 2 is the lazy gardener myth. This was something that Bill Mollison was talking about, and he's got a video where he's planting some potatoes, and I love this video actually. It's great, it's funny. Bill Mollison's a funny, very charismatic guy, and he might not have individually meant more than he did there, but a lot of people have taken it out of context. And there's a lot of people, if you go on YouTube and put in lazy gardener, you get a lot of videos. This is the concept. This is a thing that people really think can be done. And I can tell you that it isn't. You cannot be lazy and be a farmer, period. Maybe you can with a garden, but again, we're talking about agriculture here. We're talking about solutions for food systems that will feed the world, or at least large communities. And if you want that, and you want predictable yields, and you want production that you can depend on when you expect it, you can't be lazy. It just doesn't work. You try to be lazy, you get tons of weeds in your farm, and that's when you lose production. That's when food is wasted. So again, agriculture doesn't exist in nature. Maybe it's great that we try to take aspects of nature, just like here at La Ferme des Quatre Temps in Quebec. We take aspects of that, integrate it, but we should be objective about these things. We should look at these things not through an ideological lens, this is how I want the world to be and this is how it ought to be. It's, okay, this is how the world should be, but is this how it actually is? And not be afraid to find contradicting evidence, because I think that is something that is sometimes lacking in the sustainable agriculture space, is looking at things objectively and using the scientific method by creating a hypothesis and then trying to disprove your hypothesis to see if it actually works and if it's actually real. And I think a lot of people and a lot of farmers, myself included, I was one of them, is suffering from a serious case of confirmation bias, where we have an idea of how something ought to be and then we only try to prove that, and that skews our perception because we're only looking for things that confirm our bias. So that's what I would say to that one. Number 3 is the idea that everything should be mulched, that the soil should always be covered with straw, which is very typical in permaculture, or even now wood chips. Now, I don't want to say that we shouldn't cover the soil, because we should, but we should be practical about it. And if you try to cover all of your beds with straw or wood chips, it's going to make it hard to do a lot of types of crops. Now, That's not to say that some technology might not come up at some point that allows us to do that. Perhaps a seeder, a hand-push seeder that can seed carrots at this density in a 30-inch bed through mulch. Maybe somebody has yet to make that, but I haven't seen it yet. And it's impossible to do crops like this in thick mulched beds. Now, mulching with compost, that's something else, because good finished compost can actually be seeded right into. And I think that's where there might be a solution that kind of meets halfway, is looking at different types of mulch. And also not being afraid of using synthetic mulches like tarps and landscape fabric. These things are just practical. And I'm all about the idea that the soil should stay covered. To me, that's really self-evident in this style of farming, at least with market gardening, is you want to cover the soil when it's not in production, and also cover the soil with the crop. And that's more of the John Jevons biointensive idea, that when a crop becomes 50 to 75% mature, it shades out the bed and the crop becomes the mulch. I think that's far more of a practical way to do it than to cover everything with straw or wood chips. With straw or wood chips, if you mulch everything, it can actually cause problems for you, especially in the sense that in the springtime, if you're in a cold climate, it's going to take your soil longer to warm up. So sometimes people are removing mulch, and that's a lot of work. Whereas something like a tarp, you can just peel off. It's a lot more practical. Too much mulch can also cause fungus problems for you if you are in a wet climate. So there's that consideration there. So this idea that everything should be mulched with straw or wood chips, again, it's context. There is some contexts where mulching with those things is totally practical. Now, mulching something like a perennial hedgerow with straw or wood chips is a great idea, because you don't need to keep digging into those beds and putting in new crops. So that's a total practical application. But when it comes to annual based vegetable production that's consistent and is harvested when you expect it to and gives you the yield that you expect, mulching things like this just doesn't really make sense. Number 4 is the idea that everything should be swaled. So a lot of people's land is on a slope. It's hard to find, at least in many parts of the world, land that's totally flat, maybe unless you live in a prairie or something like that. And this idea of creating swales for everything was something that came out of permaculture. And swales are a really good idea in the right context. But I've gone to many farms where they've put in swales or they've put in water catchment in the wrong places, and it's made a lot of extra work for them to undo. So even in this present context where I'm standing right now, this whole property is sloped down to the south. It all drains down that way. And in this climate here in Quebec, they get a lot of annual rain. Most of these plots, these bed blocks, don't have to have permanent irrigation on them because of that. And so there's no reason to swale this land. There's no reason to stop the flow of water on this land. In fact, here they want to encourage it going down, and then they catch it in certain places. But if you were to swale here, you would probably just create more problems, because you would have too much water that would slow down the production of your crops, especially in the earlier season, because it's going to keep things wet. And here at this particular spot, we're high and dry. So what they want to do is drain things down, and they have certain catchment areas, and so in a way they're using principles of swaling, but they're not doing it in the way where we've just got trenches on contour where we're stopping or slowing the flow of water at all. We want to actually keep it moving. So swales are really key in a context. In a dry climate, in a dry arid climate, swales might be a great idea. But in a climate where you get a decent amount of natural rainflow, or where you get a decent amount of natural rainfall, you don't need swales. You don't want swales. Now, number 5 is one that I find in every workshop I ever taught, in every place, I'm sort of undoing this myth. The idea that with the right beneficial plants and beneficial insects if you create habitat for them, just like what we have here at La Ferme des Quatre Temps. We've got hedgerows in every block of 10. We've got all kinds of perennial area and natural habitat on this farm. This farm is an incredible example of taking the best of permaculture principles and integrating them into the design. And there's bird life everywhere. There's all kinds of predatory bugs everywhere. It's incredible. However, they're still using insect netting all the time. They're still doing a lot of the things that most market gardens would do. So yes, they have all these beneficials around, but it's not going to make it so that they don't have to use those things like insect netting. Look, on a farm, you're going to have pests. Agriculture does not exist in nature. And agriculture requires somewhat of an element of monoculture. And I'm talking in the smallest sense. We have 4 beds of onions here. We have, 6 or 7 beds of carrots. We've got 3 beds of lettuce under that caterpillar tunnel. I'm talking about that because that is just practical. To have everything strewn about and mixed about isn't going to be able to give you any type of dependable and predictable yield, because it's going to take so much time to walk around and get 5 heads of lettuce here and then walk and then get a bunch more there. And you need to have little chunks of monoculture to make your farm efficient. So that is going to attract pests, unfortunately. And even at this farm, where they have done incredible things, like they've got all these perennial areas, they've got hedgerows every 10 beds, so they're blocks of 10. And they've actually brought a lane ingam here. They've sprayed compost tea all over this farm. They've probably had the best access to the best resources and information and experts that they can on this farm. Yet they're still using insect netting, and they're still using even, prescribed beneficial insects in their greenhouses. So the beneficial insects that they use in greenhouses and nurseries aren't just insects that you can attract by having perennial hedgerows and things like that. These are actually ordered from a company, and then they're released into an enclosed environment. If you go and buy yourself 1,000 ladybugs and release them right here and expect them to do anything, they're not. They'll eat a few aphids and then they'll fly away. So beneficial insects they're actually used in conventional agriculture, but in greenhouses, because in a greenhouse you can enclose them and you can trap them in there, and then they're kind of forced to eat the pest. So the point being here is that this idea that if you just plant some beneficials around your farm and you're not going to have pest problems is insane. And it might be true in a garden. It might be true on a homestead. It might be true on a very, very, very tiny farm. I'm talking like one backyard farm, maybe. But even then, with all the farms I've visited in my career, I have never seen a farm that didn't have pest problems. They're everywhere. And again, it circles back to the idea, because agriculture does not exist in nature. We can't expect the things that happen in natural ecology to happen in agriculture. We can mix the two and find some kind of hybrid, some kind of middle ground, but to assume that you can farm and plant a bunch of crops and not have any insect pressure or pests just because you've got some perennials and beneficial plants around is flawed thinking. And I want to save people the time and trouble from going through that and hoping for the best and then experiencing the worst. Hope for the best and plan for the worst. All right, guys, those are my 5 myths of permaculture. I hope you found that video helpful. If you did, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification button next to it, like and share the videos with your friends. All right, guys, talk to you later.